Hi, welcome to our channel of IGNOU audiobooks. Indira Gandhi National Open University, School of Continuing Education, Bachelor's Degree Program, Elective Course, Rural Development, BRDE101 Rural Development, Indian Context, Block L Rural Society, Unit 4 Rural Urban Interactions. 4.0 Aims and Objectives. This unit aims at revealing the nature of rural-urban interactions in India. It will deal with the concept of rural-urban interactions, human migration and its impact on rural and urban society, dimensions of and principal mediators in rural-urban interactions, and continuity and change in the rural and urban societies. At the end of this unit, you must be able to understand the concepts of the rural and the urban and rural-urban interactions. Appreciate the concept and types of human migration and its impact on rural and urban societies. Comprehend the nature of rural-urban interactions in various dimensions of life in India. Identify principal mediators in rural-urban interactions in India, and assess the continuities and changes in the rural and urban societies. 4.1 Introduction. In the previous unit you have been acquainted with the rural power structure in India, while understanding the Panchayati Raj formed at the levels ranging from village to district through block and its connections with the provincial and national power structures. You must have discerned the rural-urban interactions that manifest in political parties, their workers and offices, headquarters of political bodies, education of local leaders and their upward linkages. In this unit we will understand the concept of rural-urban interactions and the connections of these interactions with human migration, as well as discuss the nature of the interactions in India where massive economic development in agriculture and its allied sectors and democratization of rural society have been crucial factors in accelerating interactions between the rural and the urban societies. Let us begin by understanding the meaning of the terms rural and urban. 4.2 Rural and Urban. The term rural and urban are relative terms, which can be understood in relationship of each other. They refer to two distinct ecological settings of society. A society set up in rural ecology is called rural, whereas the one formed in urban ecology is the urban. Rural ecology is close to the nature and land, with minimal alterations, is the chief component of the ecology. On the other hand, urban ecology is artificial one, i.e., cultured form of the nature. Taking from V.K. Srivastav's sociological description, a comparative understanding of the two types of society is presented here. 1. In comparison of the urban, the rural is a small society, that is, it has a small population and a smaller physical area. Various institutions, such as police station, dispensary, and hospital, school, post office, club, etc., may or may not exist, and if they exist, they are not adequate, or may not have all the facilities that are found in its urban counterpart. 2. Density of the rural population is also low and it may be clustered on the basis of social status, that is, the people occupying the same status may share the same neighborhood and may observe considerable social, and sometimes physical, distance from others, especially those who are positioned low in hierarchy. On the other hand, the urban population is large in size, heterogeneous in composition and secular in attitude. 3. A sizable rural population is engaged in agriculture, which is the mainstay of their life. Besides, a rural society has several other groups, engaged in various arts and crafts, usually known as artisans and craftspersons, who regularly supply their services to agriculturalists in exchange for grains and cereals. But urban population is largely engaged in secondary, manufacturing, and tertiary, servicing, occupations. 4. Rural society has some full-time and a large number of part-time specialists. Craftsmen and artisans also indulge in agricultural pursuits, especially during the monsoon. The Agricultural produce of small agriculturalists is principally for domestic consumption, whereas manufactured goods and services in urban society are meant for their supply in market. 5. Rural society is regarded as the repository of traditional mores and folkways. It preserves the traditional culture, and many of its values and virtues are carried forward to urban areas of which they become a part after some alterations. When it is said that India lives in villages, it means not only that villages are the abodes of 3/4 of Indians, but also that the fundamental values of India society and civilization are preserved in villages, and from where they are transmitted to towns and cities. One cannot have an idea of the spirit of India unless her villages are understood. On the other hand, urban society is forward-looking and future-oriented, as compared to the backward-looking and slow-changing rural society. Thus, the rural and the urban signify certain visible differences in their settings. The way the rural and the urban relate to each other is perceived differently among social scientists. Let us now discuss how the rural-urban relationship has been perceived in social sciences. 4.3 Perceptions on the rural-urban relationship. The rural-urban relationship has been broadly perceived in three ways, namely, I as rural-urban dichotomy, 2 as rural-urban continuum, and 3 as rural-urban interactions. Dichotomous constructions of human society are as old as the social sciences. In this kind of characterization of societal types, the two worlds have been viewed as systems formed of distinctive and often contradistinctive elements. There are a number of familiar distinctions between primitive and civilized societies in terms of number and diversity of social groups. The classifications such as Ferdinand Tönnies Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, Emile Durkheim's Mechanical and Organic Solidarity, Sir Henry Maine's Status and Contract, and Herbert Spencer's Militant and Industrial Societies offer important dichotomies of social characteristics. The dichotomous classification of the societies into the two major types of the rural and the urban led the sociologists to confine their studies to two watertight branches of sociology, viz., rural sociology and urban sociology. The two disciplines conceptualized rural and urban communities as the polar types having no actual link between each other. This trend is observed in the village studies by Charles Metcalfe and others in the British period and by S.C. Dubé, Maurice Opler and M.N. Srinivas in the 1950s and 1s.960s after independence of India. Srinivas examined the spread middle of classical, great tradition of the literati from national to regional and then to the local levels. He conceptualized how the upper strata could provide the model of behavior along ritual dimension which is emulated at lower levels through a process he called Sanskritization. In his opinion, the emulation usually takes place in the situation of improvement in economic or political position of the group concerned due to its contact with the source of the great tradition. When a caste or subcaste attempts to move upward in the local hierarchy, very often it faces opposition by the dominant caste in the village or region. The concepts like parochialization and universalization have been used by McKim Marriott to locate the downward and upward movements of influences from the little and great traditions. Marriott looked into the form of a trait which it underwent in the process of devolution he called parochialization. He also pointed out the complementary process of universalization by comprehending the way in which a local or lowly tradition could become wider and more sophisticated. The dichotomous perspective neglects the existence of continuous, interdependent, complementary and overlapping relationship of the rural and the urban. The scheme of folk-urban continuum was the systematic and conscious attempt to highlight inadequacy of the dichotomous notion. It called attention to the fact that societies could be arranged on the basis of their increasing or decreasing complexity. Robert Redfield defined an ideal type, folk society, as the polar opposite of urban society. Folk society is small, isolated, non-literate and homogeneous, with a strong sense of group solidarity. The ways of living are conventionalized into a coherent system, i.e., culture. The behavior is traditional, spontaneously uncritical and personal. There is no legislation or habit of experiment or reflection for intellectual ends. Kinship-based relationship and institutions constitute the type of its experience. Familial group is the unit of action, the sacred prevails over secular, and the economy is based on status rather than on market. Redfield concerns himself largely with the folk people of the continuum. It is the characteristic of folk society, which receives the descriptive attention. Different qualities of the urban type are then left as their logically opposite to those which characterize the folk. Urban society is never actually discussed as ideal type nor is explicitly named. But Redfield usually refers to it as modern urbanized society or by some variant of the phrase. Implicit in the use of this pole is, however, the idea that it stands for urbanized society in general and that modern Western society provides the specific case approximately. In his studies of Tepoztlán, 1930, and Yucatán, 1940, in Mexico, Redfield concluded that increase of contact brings about heterogeneity in and disorganization of culture and that it is one sufficient cause for secularization and individualism. The folk-urban continuum deals with the problems of relative degree of presence or absence of polar characteristics, which vary not only among cultures but also within them. Thus, the real societies, which varying in terms of constituent elements, are conceptualized to be lying in between the two polar opposites of folk and urban societies on a continuum. The folk-urban continuum did highlight the continuity between the rural and the urban in terms of increasing or decreasing complexity. But this scheme, also, fell short of revealing relationship of interdependence between the two societies, and it is also not quite free from the dichotomous perception of the rural and the urban. After the Second World War, those countries which were ruled by the Western colonial powers attained independence in the wake of the planned development activities initiated in these newly liberated countries. The social scientists experienced a lot of newly emerging areas of interactions, besides the traditional ones, between the rural and the urban society in these countries. Recent changes in political, religious and economic sectors of life have added an urban component in rural life. The nature of rural communities, therefore, called for a re-examination of the efforts of understanding their interactions with other similar communities and urban centers. Interactions between rural and urban have always existed, but their perceptions took a long time to come beyond the village. The perspective of rural-urban interactions brought into relief multiple and ever-going interactions between the two societies. 4.4 Concept of rural-urban interactions. When focused on the interactions between the rural and the urban, it is not a question of rural versus urban. Rather, it is a quest to know the way the rural is interacting with the urban and vice versa. Rural life centered around families, kin groups, castes, and religious groups is enriched through its urban contacts in economic, educational, political and ritual spheres. Modernizing agencies operate through banks, state legislation, planning and mass media in village. Village is not an isolated entity in itself. Rather, through its urban components it can be seen in active interaction with city. Both, the rural entities and the urban centers, know this need. They have either extended the scope of interactions of their social institutions or developed the requisite social networks to cope with the situations. The interactions are reflected through a mutual exchange system of goods and services between the two sectors. The ruralites are dependent on the urbanites for their banking and credit needs, for purchase of agricultural equipment and other supplies, for marketing of farm products and even for commercial recreation. In the same way, the urban sector is dependent on the rural sector for food supply or cheap labor, for the vast market of its manufactured goods, for sale of skills and technical knowledge and for provision of administrative functions. Nagpur 1996. Surplus rural wealth beyond the needs of meeting subsistence is reinvested into agriculture in the form of machinery and modern inputs. For this purpose the villagers establish urban co-actions through adult franchise, institutions of local government and participations in general elections. These connections add new varieties to polity as well as are used to realize their interests. Life in the villages revolving around various rituals of the life cycle and regional festivals find new vistas in the use of technology, trucks, tractors, buses, motorcycles, decorations and electronic media. Growing commercialization of agriculture both in food crops and cash crops is evident in the acquisition of new technology and the Growing urban institutions in the villages, Chauhan 1990. The emerging new lifestyle of the villagers reflects the cultural assimilation between ruralites and urbanites. Rural-urban interactions offer insights into the interactions between the classical, great traditions of the literate and the little traditions of the illiterate folk. In the developed countries like the erstwhile Soviet Union, the surplus from agriculture enabled the industry to come into being, and then the surplus of industry was used for developing agriculture. The extension of schooling and medical facilities to rural areas reduced the gap, and the relations between the rural and the urban had emerged to be no longer antagonistic. With regard to intergenerational difference, the older generation by habit wanted to remain rural, whereas the new generation looked to the city for better educational and career opportunities. For the purpose of understanding, the rural-urban interactions broadly comprise three aspects, namely, the nature of activities exploitative or cooperative, the spheres of activities economic, political and cultural, and the way, traditional or modern, the rural-urban interactions are reflected. Social structure of an entity is the best tool where the fields of interaction are confined to the same territory. But, as a tool of analysis, it becomes weak when these fields cut across each other's boundaries and territory of community. Network and modes of production are two other important approaches to understand rural-urban relations. Radcliffe-Brown, 1940-222, first introduced the term network in his definition of social structure as a complex network of relations. But John Barnes first introduced the idea of using network as an analytical tool in his analysis of Norwegian Island, Parish, Burmah 1954. In Brayton's Island, the stationary field was dominated by the domestic, agricultural and administrative areas, the fluid field by industrial area, consisting of fishing vessels, marketing, cooperative and herring oil factories. The third field, which links the other two, stationary and fluid fields of interaction, was termed as social network, Baines 1954-237. B. R. Chauhan emphasized the relevance of the concept of social network in the analysis of articulation between rural and urban communities. He suggested that the concept is helpful in analyzing the cultural, political, administrative and economic dimensions of the social phenomenon. He has extensively shown various rural-urban interactions and intermediaries in day-to-day life in the villages of Western Uttar Pradesh. Rural-urban interactions have been labeled variously by the social scientists, such as Rural-Urban Articulations by B. R. Chauhan, Country-Town Nexus by K. L. Sharma, or Rural-Urban Connections in general. All the terms bear the different manifestation of the same concept. Factors of rural-urban interactions. Rural-urban interactions are caused by various factors, which are found location-specific, i.e., the conditions and circumstances of the interactions are vary from place to place and time to time. As a result, we find various patterns of the interactions slow or fast, more or less, intensive or extensive and so on. Major factors of the interactions are being mentioned here. 1. Human migration from villages to towns and vice versa is the most important factor, responsible for immense interactions between the rural and the urban. 2. Development of means of transport and communication have minimized or eliminated the hurdles of physical distance, national boundaries and cultural differences. 3. Extension of political and administrative institutions in rural areas has necessitated constant interactions for both the entities. 4. Expansion of market has not only arranged a space for rural-urban interactions but also contributed to commercialization of various crops and land. 5. Development initiatives for planned social change in rural areas have significant consequences for emergence of new lifestyles and social differentiation in villages. 6. Industrialization and urbanization are the two interrelated processes which have been responsible for in-migration as well as absorption of villages and rural labor in cities and industrial centers. 7. Kinship connections like those of family, marriage, caste or community and religion have traditionally facilitated rural-urban interactions, and these connections are ever present in the interactions of modern institutions as well. 8. Religious pilgrimages and cultural tours have been the traditional sources of rural-urban interactions, which have received quantum jump in the wake of improved transport facilities and revolution in communication technologies. Of these factors, human migration has been a unique source and ever-going process of multifarious rural-urban interactions. Let us discuss human migration and rural-urban interactions. Check your progress 1. Note: I. Write your answer in the space provided below. 2. Check your answer by reading the text once again. 1. What do you mean by rural and urban? 2. Identify major activities in rural-urban interaction. 4.5 Human migration and rural-urban interactions. Migration is as age-old phenomenon. Since the primitive era, people have been migrating from one place to another in the form of individuals, families and groups for various purposes of food, shelter, security, trade, pilgrimage and adventure. It occurs at various levels of space: international, national, regional and local. Migration has always specific meaning, factors and impacts which are being discussed here in the context of rural-urban interactions. 4.5.1 Concept of human migration. According to the United Nations Multilingual Demographic Dictionary, migration is a form of geographical mobility or spatial mobility between one geographical unit and another, generally involving a change in a residence from the place of origin or place of departure to the place of destination or place of arrival. Such migration is called permanent migration and should be distinguished from other forms of movement which do not involve a permanent change of residence. In the definition, migration refers to a specific type of spatial or geographical mobility which implies 4 characteristics. I. Relatively permanent shift of residence of people from one geographical unit to another one, for example, from a village to a town or from one village to another village or from one town to another town. 2. Direction of the shift. 3. Causes of the shift and 4. Impacts of the shift on the two units, i.e., place of departure and the place of arrival. Migratory movement is, therefore, not merely a physical movement of people from one place to another but is a set of social, cultural, economic, political and other circumstances as well. 4.5.2 Direction of human migration. In the rural-urban context, migration takes place in the following 4 directions. I. Rural to rural migration. 2. Urban to urban migration. 3. Rural to urban migration. 4. Urban to rural migration. Of these types of migrations, the last 2, third and fourth, types are directly related to rural-urban interactions. All over the world the people have been migrating from villages to towns, and modern forces have a great role in accelerating the migration of this type. In developing countries like India, it is a very significant process of demographic changes and urbanization in the recent years. On the other hand, this process has saturated in some of the developed countries where differences between the rural and the urban are no more significant from developmental viewpoint. Rather, in these countries the reverse process, i.e., urban to rural migration has started, wherein the people shift their residence to peaceful environment, equally equipped with all modern facilities, in the countryside. In the developing countries the migration of the latter type is a very limited process. Yet, in the context of rural development, the rural sector is also coming up with various facilities and economic resources in the countryside, and this has initiated a little of migration from urban centers to developing or economically significant rural areas in the counties like India, but it is still insignificant. You are listening to this audiobook on Audio Learn IGNOU.
4th May 2003 Factors of Human Migration. Factors of migration are generally classified into the following 2 broad categories. D. Push factors. 2. Pull factors. Push factors consist of the conditions of relative deprivation in one or more of physical, social, cultural, economic and political aspects of migrants' life in the place of their departure, which force them out from the place of their origin. On the other hand, pull factors refer to those life conditions in the place of migrants' destination which attract them for arrival towards it. Better infrastructural facilities like rail, road, communication, electricity, market, employment opportunities, social status, secular attitude, egalitarian values, democratic ideals, rule of law, human rights, etc. in urban centers attract the people of different social layers and levels from the villages. In fact, migration is somewhat more than simply a seasonal, cyclical, temporary or permanent movement of people, it is representative of social hierarchy in the countryside. According to K. L. Sharma, the three factors, namely, macrostructural changes, social stratification and specific conditions pertaining to specific villages and towns, determine the nature, extent and social characteristics of migration. Therefore, different push and pull factors in village life are combined in unidirectional migratory movements of its different sections towards towns. Biplav Dasgupta and Roy Lashley revealed that unequal distribution of resources in the villages is a key factor for urban migration, but the landless or the poorest do not migrate necessarily. There is a dualistic pattern of migration consisting of young and old, poor and rich, illiterate and highly educated, Harijans and upper castes. There is a range of the educated migrants, including the school and college dropouts, the educated with poor, moderate, good and excellent performances, and the technically trained persons. Sharma notes that caste, class and power background of people matters in determining migration, mobility and rural-urban connections. Acute unemployment, poverty and pauperization are more of a push factor in Indian villages. The poor may migrate more in numbers than the rich, the illiterate may leave their native places more than the educated people, and the lower caste people may have to migrate more often than the upper castes. But it does not mean that owing to their numerical preponderance among the migrants in towns and cities, the poor, the illiterate and the lower caste people establish more rural-urban connections compared to the rich, the educated and the upper caste migrants. The construction workers from rural areas working in metropolises like Delhi, though substantial in number, are poor, illiterate and low caste. Their existential conditions are comparable with the worst slum dwellers in the city. They have been pushed out of their native places because of poverty, unemployment and indebtedness. There is hardly anything they give to the city except their labor, and they get hardly anything except the barest means for their survival. Sharma further writes that migration necessarily implies social and occupational mobility irrespective of caste, class and educational background of the migrants. It is not that only the paupers and the educated unemployed people migrate to towns and cities from villages. Some people also migrate to towns and cities for fulfilling their cherished aspirations and ambitions for which ample opportunities are lacking in their native villages. Some migrate to towns for more comforts and facilities. Rural elite including the political elite from among the caste Hindus, scheduled castes and scheduled tribes have a tendency to settle down in towns and cities. The beneficiaries of Green Revolution settle in towns and cities for upgrading themselves as businessmen and entrepreneurs. 4th May 2004 Impact of human migration on rural and urban societies. Human migration leaves its impact on both rural and urban societies, as it involves a population shift in geographical unit of residence and a purpose in the shifting. The impact of migration may therefore be broadly discussed at the following three levels. I. Demographic level. 2. Environmental level. 3. Social level. Migration affects the population size in a way entirely different from that of mortality and fertility rates in the rural and urban settings. As a result of migration, a village experiences a sudden decline in growth rate of population and lack of the requisite working hands, whereas a town encounters increased density, expansion and growth rate of population. The changes in the population size affects the environment, society and culture in the two settings. Urban migration increases pressure on the environment of town consisting of existing infrastructural facilities like basic amenities, housing, electricity, water and sanitation, means of transport and communication, parks, markets, schools, etc. This causes unplanned growth of towns characterized by slums, overcrowded streets, lack of basic amenities and other facilities. On the other hand, the environment of the rural sector is neglected at the cost of over-attention of planners paid to the urban sector. Towns, especially the capital towns like Delhi, Bangalore, Jaipur, Guwahati etc. have witnessed maximum growth through the process of migration from rural areas. The demographic and environmental impacts, combined, affect the social fabric of towns in various ways. It leads to unemployment, poverty, social deviance, deterioration of law and order, discontent, arid political movements and upheavals. Besides, in migration from villages and expansion of urban centers by inclusion of villages and small towns located in the hinterland of big towns and cities are the two most significant factors responsible for rapid urban growth. These factors explain better the rural-urban connections and the emergence of new structures and relations. Urbanization consists of a great deal of rural material and cultural inputs which determine the extent of impact of urban values, attitudes and behavioral patterns on the rural population. Check your progress too. Note: I. Write your answer in the space provided below. 2. Check your answer by reading the text once again. 1. What do you mean by human migration? 2. What do you understand by the concepts of push and pull factor in migration? 4.6 Rural-urban interactions in India. In India, the process of rural-urban interactions has ever been working through cultural, political and economic factors. In the traditional culture of India, the existence of the literate great tradition and its relation to the little traditions in the rural setting has been highlighted by Markham Marriott in the concepts of parochialization or downward mobility of the elements of great tradition and universalization or upward movement of the elements of little traditions. Srinivas has given the concept of Sanskritization, which, too, is a case of interaction between lower and higher cultural groups, the former accepting the models of behavior of the latter for emulation. In recent years, B.R. Chauhan's Towns in the Tribal Setting and Yogesh Attal's Local Communities and National Politics have illustrated the linkages between towns and villages. Chauhan 1970, Attal 1971. Most of the studies on rural-urban connections seem to have proceeded along channels of communication and culture. The channels and dimensions of interactions have further differentiated in the wake of massive developmental action and democratization in the post-independence period. The rural-urban interactions in India taking place in different dimensions of social life are being discussed here. 4.7 Sectors and dimensions of rural-urban interactions in India. According to B.R. Chauhan, connections of a villager with the wider world are reflected in an immediate regional setting which consists of both the rural and urban counterparts. Therefore, on the basis of their quality, the rural-urban contacts can be seen in the following two sectors of life. I. Traditional sector. The traditional interactions took place through administrative connections, a small market, and the urban pilgrim centers. 2. Modernized sector. The modern interactions are related to sale of commercial crops and purchase of valuable goods, education and health. Further, Chauhan arranges all the interactions in these two sectors along the following three dimensions of life. I. Cultural dimension. 2. Administrative and political dimension. 4. Economic dimension. The rural-urban interactions, traditional as well as modern, taking place along these three dimensions, cultural, administrative and economic, are being discussed here. I. Cultural dimension. Interconnections are found between the classical, great traditions of the literate and the little traditions of the illiterate folk. These traditions are spread from the national to the regional and to the local levels. In many cases, the upper strata could provide a model of behavior along ritual lines to be emulated at lower levels through Sanskritization. It indicates the downward flow of ritual behavior and values, in which a trait of great tradition undergoes devolution or parochialization. On the other hand, a local or lowly tradition becomes wider and more sophisticated through its upward movement or universalization. Hence, the cities reflect regional traditions in their most sophisticated form with regard to the specialization of actors, places, and themes. The religious centers connect the city's sacred traditions, increasing specializations among performers with the diversification among visitors or devotees. The sacred centers have emerged as the meeting points of urban centers and rural hinterlands, along with the development of institutions like dharmshalas, inns, and professional priests. With the improved means of communication now, the density of pilgrimages has gone up along with the further spread of rural-urban interactions as the agencies facilitating them. One finds increasing use of modern technology like tractors and trolleys or modernized bullock carts with pneumatic tires to convey people to regional pilgrimage or mela centers. In the celebrations of the rituals of the life cycle, particularly marriage and death ceremonies, the villagers arrange feasts, exchange gifts, and enter into multiple interactions with the nearby urban centers. Large villages have developed supporting centers for urban links in these matters, which facilitate rural-urban connections. In the value system of the villagers, the greater urban content in menus, gifts or entertainment at the ceremonies and in other rural ways of life has become the symbol for status enhancement. The rural people make use of the urban ethos in interactions, secure prestigious band of music from towns, use appropriate film music, display fireworks, employ expert cooks from outside, and introduce certain urban varieties of dishes. Gifts to bridegrooms include scooters and motorcycles, costly wristwatches, clothes made of synthetic fibers, and electrical gadgets like radios, fans, etc. Gifts to brides include ornaments, usually obtained from urban jewelers, saris of either silk or nylon, household decorations including furniture like double beds, sofa sets, dressing tables, and kitchen utensils of stainless steel. They organize wrestling and poetic competitions and play host to dance or drama parties. Communication networks emanating from the national and state capitals and other major cities have reached the far-flung villages. Television is reaching out in hitherto remote rural areas, while radio has been since long an effective source of rural communication. On the production side of television, there is some concern for including specific programs for farmers and certain recreational items. Radio, too, has its rural programs, but the interests of the rural listeners are increasingly reported to lean towards film music. The cinema has also been a meeting point for the rural and urban people. Thus, there is a two-way traffic in mass communications, the town extending to reach the rural populace while the latter seeks occasion to obtain urban exposure. 2. Administrative and political dimension. Rural-urban interactions along administrative and political dimension have a long history. A village was defined as a revenue unit by the rulers in the past. The state made a number of arrangements for collecting land revenues, which gave rise to the mediating roles of the patwari, headman, zemindar, lambadar, jagirdar, and the rajas. During the British rule in India, zamindars emerged as important links between the administration and the villagers. The relations between the state and the villagers have not remained smooth. A number of tribal revolts have been witnessed in India even preceding the struggle for independence. The freedom struggle was itself given a new dimension when Gandhi recognized the poor economic position of the villagers and their role in the national economy. Within the Indian National Congress, special attention began to be given to the problems of the peasants, the revival of cottage industries, and the spread of education. Implementation of land reforms and community development, introduction of Panchayati Raj, and spread of party organizations from district down to village have strengthened the rural-urban connections. Politics has entered into the traditional groups like village, caste, and family, dividing them into factions. The mediators and brokers, mostly of political background, have come up to provide constant linkage of the rural people with the urban centers. Economic dimensions. The economic relations of the villagers in the colonial past were catapulted into the arena of the international market through the cultivation of cotton and other commercial crops like jute, the setting up of tea plantations in Assam with migrant labor drawn even from the tribal areas, and the engaging of labor in construction work relating to railways, roads and canals. The initial growth of industries attracted labor from areas of low agricultural productivity like eastern Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, flocking to cities like Kolkata, Ahmedabad and Bombay. Initially, a person earned income in an urban center to return to his place of origin on retirement or at leisure, which marked the phase of semi-permanent migration. In a sense, it halted urbanization, but it contributed to urban influence in the rural areas. The Green Revolution and commercial crops introduced the market ethos within the rural setting and enabled the village and the city to draw somewhat closer. The new economic enterprises have attracted dealers of fertilizers, pesticides, advanced technology and improved seeds to the countryside in areas of the Green Revolution. The emergence of agroservice stations has brought modern technology to the doorsteps of the farmers. New occasions have arisen for the villagers to establish links with urban markets and administrative centers for connections to the electricity grid, the purchase and installation of tube wells and pumping sets, the purchase of oil, the disposal of cane to sugar mills and grains to the market, or obtaining various types of loans from the state and other banking agencies. 4.8 Principal mediators in rural-urban interactions in India. The extension of democratic and administrative order to the villages, as well as the increasing mechanization of agriculture in the wake of the Green Revolution, has generated important areas of activities. These areas are covered by principal mediators between the rural and the urban centers. The new needs of the villagers in these areas appear first among the developed sections of the villagers. But even they have to acquire the necessary skills to meet the demands of complex, formal requirements. They try to know the unknown areas and procedures of activities through the known individuals and networks. For this, they establish their connections with the formal structure through the extension of the primordial ties. The principal mediators are the rural elite and brokers working in political, legal and economic spheres. They are tied in peculiar relationship with each other. The legal sector poses the problems which need to be resolved either through an understanding between the parties or by establishing ties with the legal and the administrative apparatus. The political leader appears in role of problem solver. The sale and purchase of machinery like tractors require knowledge of the markets, provision of finance and the establishment of ties with a technician middleman. In these matters, some help of political leaders as well as of kinsmen is sought. The rural elite emerged through democratic decentralization at various levels of the rural politics are very much performing the role of principal mediators, as they have to keep hold on their political constituencies. In a way, mediation availed them of a constant opportunity for extending political constituencies. The brokers are drawing generally from the workers of political parties or the kinsmen with technical, legal or market knowledge. The brokers and the rural elites are also tied in social, political, and or economic relationships which increase the effectivity of their action. 4.9 Continuity and change in rural and urban societies in India. In the foregoing discussion you have come to know that in the immense rural-urban interactions there is found a rural component in the urban society, infused through migration, and an urban component in the rural society in the wake of increased activity of development, democratic decentralization and revolution in communication technology. As a result of the interactions, no doubt, both the societies are changing, but at the same time many of their structural and cultural aspects are continuing. The continuities and changes of the two societies may be discussed at the following three structural levels. I. Social structure. 2. Economic structure. Il. Power structure. The traditional institutions like family, caste, kinship, marriage, religion and ethnicity have been important institutions in the making of both the societies in India. These institutions are still continuing and playing an active role in both the societies. In the urban society we find evidence of some structural differentiation and emergence of new groups like class, club and occupational status groups. A question arises, Why do the Indian towns and cities exhibit so low level of urbanization of their social structure? The answer is implicit in the nature of urbanization and rural-urban interactions. The rapid urban growth in India owes to two most significant factors. In migration from villages and 2. Expansion of urban centers by inclusion of villages and small towns located in the hinterland of big towns and cities. As a result of U.S., the same social hierarchy and its institutional forms are found extending between the two societies, on the one hand, and therefore there does exist a large domain of interactions within each of the two societies as well as between them, covered by the same traditional institutions. The urban society reflects a greater change in attitudes, lifestyle and behavior patterns, which is also multi-layered in the presence of multiple hierarchies of the urban population. Thus, the cultural diffusion in the villages is also differentially distributed. You are listening to this audiobook on Audio Learn IGNOU.
The economic structure in the two societies shows greater changes yet significant continuities. In the urban society, occupational structure mostly comprises of secondary and tertiary occupations, and their technical and professional base has significantly increased. Yet, in the small towns, the occupational structure still draws much from the primary and traditional occupational sector. Looked at the occupational relationship, it is evident that the traditional institutions are still permeating in the towns of various sizes. In the rural society, the elimination of zamindari system and implementation of land reforms have resulted into a new agrarian structure. This structure is different from the traditional one in that it has broadly three strata, namely, the upper, the middle and the lowest, whereas the traditional structure consisted of a large number of strata. Besides, in the new structure the relationship is less exploitative and is based on less physical and social distance between the strata. Yet, the inequalities are continuing. In both the societies, structural differentiation in the form of new occupations is evident, but the traditional institutions are still mediating their occupational distribution. The power structure is reflecting a totally new form, i.e., democratic power structure based on adult franchise. Political parties are playing important role in the structuring and functioning of power. When looked into the social background of power holders, it is evident that the traditional social institutions like caste, kinship, religion and ethnicity are very much active in political mobilization of people in the political parties and other political institutions. Thus, there is institutional continuity in all the structures, yet various changes have also occurred through differentiation of structures or diffusion of culture. The mediating social institutions have survived through the rural-urban migration and interactions where the fertile grounds for their continuity are continuing. Owing to this reason, even the urban society could not impinge any decisive social impacts on the rural society. The cultural changes, especially in the material or technological aspect, have been significantly received even in the rural society. 4.10 Summary. Rural-urban interactions refer to the behavior patterns taking place between the rural and the urban society in their cultural, politico-administrative and economic aspects. The interactions occur in the traditional as well as in the modern sectors. Modern political and economic changes have generated new areas of activities wherein even the developed sections of the villages lack knowledge and urban contacts. Therefore, the rural elite and brokers become the principal mediators of the rural-urban interactions to solve the problems in political, legal and economic sectors. 4.11 Keywords. Rural-urban interactions. The behavioral exchanges between the rural and the urban society along cultural, political and economic dimension in traditional and modernized sectors. Rural-urban articulations, the cultural, politico-administrative and economic connections between the rural and the urban society. Country-town nexus, a set of ties based on structural and cultural changes in both village and town proportionately or otherwise. Thank you, we will see you in the next video.